For 20 years, Warren treated me like a silent dependent, rationing our household money and demanding receipts for every pack of detergent. He believed his tooling company was the sole engine of our survival, completely unaware that his workshop sat on land owned by my grandfather's private trust. Now, as his casual cruelty turns into financial lockstep, I sit in the kitchen, holding the keys to the very walls that keep his pride alive. To watch a quiet wife dismantle the prison built by her husband's arrogance, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. When a husband decides his wife isn't worth the price of her dignity, how does he survive the day she decides to collect the rent? Warren sits at the head of the dark pine kitchen table every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, his black leather ledger open, a thin silver pen resting between his thumb and forefinger. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying the soft, clinical curiosity he usually reserved for reviewing machine tolerances at the workshop. "The butcher's slip from Tuesday has 2 pounds of ground beef listed, but looking back at the weekly menu you wrote on the chalkboard, you only served 1 meatloaf on Wednesday night. Where did the 2nd pound go?" I stood by the sink, a damp dish towel in my hands. The water filtration system hummed quietly behind the drywall, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that seemed to measure the silence of our home. "I froze the 2nd pound, Warren," I said, my voice low and even. "I'm using it for the beef stew next Thursday." Warren let out a slow, deliberate sigh, his pen making a small, neat checkmark on the receipt. He didn't look up. "We need to be exceptionally tight this month, Clara. Precision tooling is facing significant overhead pressures. The raw steel costs are up 12% and our shipping margins are shrinking. I can't have cash leaking from the kitchen." "I understand," I said. He closed the ledger with a soft, authoritative thud. He had spent 30 minutes auditing $32 in household groceries, treating a $4 discrepancy in meat like an act of corporate embezzlement, while his own company generated $300,000 a quarter. He liked the audit. He liked the feeling of the purse strings in his hand, the quiet satisfaction of knowing exactly how much air I was allowed to breathe before it cost him $1. Audrey came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, her laptop cradled under her arm, her eyes bright with the restless energy of a 19-year-old who believed the world was waiting for her arrival. She bypassed me entirely, walking straight to Warren's side of the table. "Dad," she said, leaning over his shoulder to show him her screen. "The deposit for the sociology study abroad block in Prague is due by Friday. The department needs the wire transfer cleared before they assign the housing." Warren looked at the screen, his face instantly softening into the indulgent, protective expression of a father who took profound pride in his ability to provide. He patted her hand, his gold watch catching the yellow light of the chandelier. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart," Warren said, his voice warm and expansive. "I'll have Silas wire the deposit directly from the corporate account tomorrow morning. You focus on your midterms." "Thanks, Dad. You're the best," Audrey said, leaning down to kiss his cheek. She closed her laptop, turned to walk out of the kitchen, and then paused, her eyes briefly landing on me as I wiped down the clean laminate countertops. "Mom," she said, her tone shifting into a lighter, slightly dismissive cadence. "Do we have any more of those lemon waters? The fridge in my room is empty." "I didn't buy them this week, Audrey," I said softly. "Your father wanted us to trim the grocery budget." Audrey let out a tiny, impatient huff, looking at Warren for a brief second of shared understanding before looking back at me. "Well, can you get them next time? They're the only ones I like." She walked out of the room, her leather sandals clicking softly on the hardwood. She didn't mean to be cruel. She had simply spent her teenage years learning that her mother's approval didn't purchase textbooks, and that the woman who cooked the meals and washed the sheets was functionally invisible because she didn't hold the checkbook. At 10 o'clock, after Warren had gone upstairs to watch the late-night business news, I walked to the small spare room at the back of the house. The room was dark, but I didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, I struck a match and lit the blue glass oil lamp that sat on the corner sideboard. It had belonged to my grandfather, Arthur Lowell, and the scent of the kerosene always brought back the memory of his quiet, dusty office on the west side of the river. I sat at the small writing desk, opened my personal laptop, the one I had purchased with a small personal inheritance before I married Warren, and logged into the Landlord portal for Lowell Holdings, LLC. The inbox had 3 unread notifications. I clicked on the first one. It was an email from Silas Cobb, the general manager of Hensley Precision Tooling. Dear Lowell Representative, the email read, we are writing to urgently request a 5-year extension on our current commercial lease for Building 4 at the West River Industrial Park. Mr. Hensley is prepared to offer a 2% annual escalation, but our corporate ledger cannot sustain any higher adjustment due to precision tooling market pressures. Please advise before the October 31st expiration, as our machinery cannot be easily relocated without major operational disruption. I looked at the date on the screen. Today was October 9th. Warren had spent 30 minutes of his evening lecturing me about a $4 pound of ground beef, completely unaware that his own multi-million-dollar tooling workshop was sitting on land owned entirely by Lowell Holdings, a private commercial real estate trust of which I was the sole legal beneficiary. And in exactly 22 days, his lease was set to expire. On Tuesday morning, Warren sat at the kitchen island, his bespoke gray suit immaculate, his silk tie adjusted to a perfect symmetrical knot. He was reviewing his emails on his phone, a cup of black coffee steaming beside his leather-bound planner. As I set his plate of poached eggs on the marble counter, he didn't look up, but his hand moved to his breast pocket. He pulled out a small, translucent orange plastic card and slid it across the island. It stopped beside my glass of water. Clara, he said, his tone flat, carrying the practiced patience of an educator explaining a simple concept to a child. I've set up a new allowance card for the household incidentals. It's got a $60 limit. It's much cleaner than the old Visa. I get real-time notifications on my phone, so we don't have to keep track of paper receipts. You can use it for the dry cleaning today. I looked at the orange card. It had no name printed on the front, only a sterile serial number. It was the kind of card parents gave to young teenagers to manage their school lunch money. A $60 limit? I asked softly, keeping my hands resting against the edge of the sink. It's for your own financial protection, honey, Warren said, taking a neat bite of his egg. I know how stressful it is for you to manage the monthly balances, especially with the inflation on the utility bills lately. This way, the business ledger stays completely isolated, and you don't have to worry about the overhead. If you need more for something specific, just text me. I can authorize a temporary increase from the app on my phone. He was putting his wife of 20 years on a digital leash, expecting me to stand in the grocery aisle and text him for permission if the price of milk and eggs exceeded his daily algorithm. I see, I said, picking up the orange card. It felt light, cheap, and entirely insignificant. Thank you, Warren. Of course, he said, checking his watch and standing up. Make sure you pick up the heavy starch shirts by 3. I have a dinner with the regional distributors tonight. At noon, I drove to the West River Industrial Park. The sky was a heavy industrial gray, the scent of river silt and hot iron hanging thick in the autumn air. I parked my modest sedan in the visitor lot of Building 4, a massive red brick warehouse with arched windows that my grandfather had purchased in 1974. The brass key ring in my coat pocket was heavy, containing the master keys to every building in the complex, keys that had never been copied, keys that had remained in my grandfather's safe until the day his estate was settled. I walked into the administrative lobby of Hensley Precision Tooling, carrying Warren's dry-cleaned shirts on a wire hanger. Silas Cobb was standing behind the reception desk, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his bald head reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. He was looking over a stack of yellow commercial shipping manifests, his face drawn into a tight, anxious scowl. When he saw me, his expression softened slightly, a look of professional politeness crossing his features. "Clara, good morning. Warren is back in the production bay with the lathe team. Do you want me to have him called?" "No, Silas, thank you," I said, hanging the shirts on the metal rack behind the desk. "I just wanted to drop these off before the afternoon shift. You look busy." Silas let out a dry, exhausted laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Busy is one word for it, Clara. Between you and me, we're in a bit of a tight corner. The landlord's leasing group, Lowell Holdings, won't answer our queries about the Building 4 lease renewal. The contract expires on the 31st of this month, and if they don't grant us an extension, we're looking at a complete operational freeze." He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "Warren is completely beside himself. Moving these 5-ton CNC milling machines to a new facility would cost us $80,000 in rigging fees alone, not to mention the 3 weeks of lost production. It would completely wipe out our Q4 liquidity. We've offered a rent increase, but they've just gone silent." I looked at the lease documents scattered across Silas's desk, recognizing the green logo of my grandfather's trust on the cover of the folder. "I'm sure they'll answer soon, Silas," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "The Lowell Group has always been very precise about their properties." "I hope so," Silas muttered, looking back at his shipping logs. "Because if they don't, Warren is going to have to make some very hard decisions about our staff." I returned home, went straight to the spare room, and lit the blue glass oil lamp on the sideboard. I opened my personal laptop and dialed the private line for Leland Thorne, the senior attorney who had managed my grandfather's estate for 30 years. He was a man of absolute discretion, a lawyer who understood that true power never required a loud voice or a public face. "Clara," Leland's voice answered on the second ring, deep and resonant. "I was just about to email you. We received another automated query from Hensley's legal team regarding Building 4. "I know, Leland," I said, watching the yellow flame flicker behind the blue glass. "Silas Cobb mentioned it to me this morning." "But more importantly," Leland continued, his paper rustling over the line, "we've received an inquiry from a commercial broker representing a shell entity called Patterson Commercial. They've made an outright cash offer of $3 million to purchase Building 4 from the Lowell portfolio." My fingers tightened around the brass key ring in my pocket. "And who is behind Patterson Commercial, Leland?" "We ran the financial routing, Clara," Leland said quietly. "The funding for the offer is secured by a secondary line of credit drawn against Hensley Precision Tooling's corporate assets. Your husband is trying to buy his own workshop's building, completely unaware that you are the sole trustee of the holding company he is negotiating with." I closed my eyes. Warren was mortgaging the very future of his company, borrowing $3 million at high interest to buy out a silent landlord, completely blind to the fact that the landlord was the woman who had spent 40 minutes finding his lost car keys this morning. "Tell the broker the building is not for sale, Leland," I said, my voice as quiet as the room. "And do not respond to the lease extension queries. Let the clock run out." "You want the lease to expire on October 31st? "Yes," I said. "Let the 31st be the day we collect the rent." At 8:30 on Wednesday evening, Warren sat at the kitchen island, eating cold pot roast. He didn't have his jacket on, his silk tie loosened, His sleeves rolled back to reveal the thick, silver hair on his forearms. He was staring at his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with a sharp, rhythmic aggression. "Clara," he said, not looking up from his screen. "I see a charge of $54.12 at the pharmacy this afternoon. What was that? The dry cleaning was only $14. "Audrey needed some sinus medication and some toiletries before she went back to her dorm," I said, placing the wooden salad bowl in the dishwasher. Warren let out a short, sharp breath through his nose. "She has her own student account for her personal items, Clara. This allowance card is strictly for household essentials. If you start blurring the lines, the budgeting system becomes entirely useless. I'm trying to keep our domestic overhead under $1,000 this month, and this kind of undisciplined spending makes it impossible." I looked down at my hands, still wet with dish soap. For 20 years, I had managed this house on whatever scraps of cash he threw onto the counter, never asking why the owner of a thriving precision tooling firm couldn't afford to let his wife buy her daughter a box of allergy medicine without a corporate review. "I understand, Warren," I said, my voice dry and even. "I'll ensure Audrey uses her own account next time." "Thank you," he said, his thumb scrolling through the app, monitoring my movements through $30 increments. Audrey came into the kitchen a moment later, her face drawn into a tight, anxious pout. She stood near Warren's shoulder, her phone clutched in her hand. "Dad," she said, her voice thin. "The study abroad coordinator just emailed me. The deposit for Prague still hasn't cleared. Friday is the absolute cutoff, and if the wire isn't confirmed, they're going to give my spot to someone on the waiting list." Warren's hand froze on his phone. He cleared his throat, a light, nervous sound, and adjusted his watch. "I talked to Silas today, Audrey. We're in the middle of a routine inventory audit, so the cash accounts are temporarily locked until Monday morning. It's just standard corporate compliance. I'll have Silas clear the wire first thing next week." Audrey's face fell. "But Dad, Monday is too late. What if the housing fills up? I'll be stuck in the off-campus dorms." She turned her head, looking at me with a sharp, ugly sigh. "Mom, did you spend the weekly budget on those organic groceries again? Dad is always having to cover for your spending, and now my Prague trip is getting messed up." She was 19, but she had already learned the language of her father's house. To her, my existence was a financial leakage, a permanent drain on her father's hard-earned success. "Audrey," I said, my voice perfectly calm, "I have not spent $1 over your father's budget." "Well, clearly someone is spending it," she muttered, turning on her heel and walking out of the kitchen, slamming her bedroom door down the hall. Warren didn't defend me. He didn't tell her that her Prague deposit was currently frozen because he had mortgaged his corporate credit line to make a $3 million cash offer on a building he didn't realize I owned. He simply took another bite of his cold meat, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. Psychological insight. A husband who cannot control his public world will always seek to completely conquer his wife's private sanctuary. He mistakes his domestic cruelty for executive power, believing that if he can make his wife small enough, his own failures will somehow disappear. Warren set his fork down, his eyes drifting across the kitchen to the sideboard, where my grandfather's blue glass oil lamp sat. "We need to clean out the spare room, Clara," he said, his tone flat, carrying a cold, executive weight. "That mahogany writing desk and the oil lamp, they're just collecting dust. I had an antique dealer look at some photos I took of them last week. He's willing to pay $4,000 for the pair. It'll clean up the clutter, and we can use the cash to offset some short-term household expenses." I felt a cold, sharp sensation in my chest. He had gone into my private room, taken photographs of my grandfather's personal belongings and negotiated their sale without ever asking for my consent. "The lamp belonged to my grandfather, Warren," I said softly, my hand resting on the counter. "I'd like to keep it." "It's a dusty piece of glass, Clara," Warren said, standing up and adjusting his tie. "Let's be practical. I'm carrying the entire financial weight of this family, and you're hoarding antiques we don't even use. I've already scheduled the dealer to pick them up on Friday afternoon. Let's not make this difficult." He turned and walked upstairs to his study, leaving his empty plate on the counter. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. I walked over to the sideboard, my fingers lightly tracing the cold blue glass of the lamp. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I pulled out my phone and sent a short text to Leland Thorne. "Leland, please draft the formal notice of lease termination for Building 4. Have the sheriff serve it to Warren's desk at Hensley Precision Tooling at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Do not offer an extension. Let the 31st be the final day." Warren wanted to sell my grandfather's $4,000 writing desk to cover his panic. On Monday morning, he was going to find out what it actually cost to sit in my grandfather's chair. On Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock, the antique dealer's van pulled into our driveway. Warren had taken a half day from the workshop to oversee the transaction. He stood in the hallway, his posture expansive, his hands tucked into his trouser pockets as he greeted the dealer, Mr. Finch, a quiet man with silver spectacles and a clinical, assessing eye. "It's in here, Finch," Warren said, his voice carrying the warm, executive confidence of a man who owned the room. "The mahogany writing desk and the blue glass lamp, both early 19th century. Clara has been meaning to downsize the spare room for months. She's just glad to get the clutter out of the house." I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, my hands folded over my linen apron. Mr. Finch looked at me, his eyes carrying a brief flicker of professional hesitation. He was an experienced dealer. He knew the difference between a home being downsized and a woman being quietly stripped of her history. "Mrs. Hensley?" Mr. Finch asked, his voice soft. "Are you comfortable with the parting of these pieces? The blue glass lamp is a rare design. Your grandfather's collection was quite famous in the county." "Clara is perfectly fine, Finch," Warren interrupted, offering a short, patronizing laugh as he stepped between us. "She's just happy to clear the space. Let's get the movers to load them up before the afternoon traffic gets heavy." I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched as the movers lifted my grandfather's mahogany desk, carrying it through the front door, the wood groaning softly under the pressure. Mr. Finch picked up the blue glass lamp, holding it carefully against his chest as he walked out. On the mahogany sideboard in the dining room, there was only a pale, clean ring of dust where the lamp had sat for 20 years. Warren reached into his pocket and pulled out the Mr. Finch's cashier's check for $4,000. He looked at it, a tight, satisfied smile touching his lips, before sliding it into his leather wallet. "I'll put this directly into the corporate reserve, Clara," he said, not looking at me. "It's much safer there, and we can use it to cover the household utility adjustments next month. We just have to keep the cash flow clean." "Of course, Warren," I said, looking at the empty circle of dust on the sideboard. "I'm glad we could clean up the clutter." On Saturday evening, the house smelled of roasted chicken. Audrey sat at the dining room table, her laptop open, her fingers typing with a light, rhythmic tapping. Warren sat opposite her, his leather binder open, a glass of Pinot Noir in his hand. "We booked the premium economy flight for Prague, Audrey," Warren said, his voice warm, expanding with the pride of a provider who had successfully navigated a difficult turn. The corporate cash cleared nicely yesterday afternoon. You'll have your housing deposit wired by Monday morning. Thanks, Dad, Audrey said, her face glowing. You're literally the best. I was so worried I'd lose the spot. She glanced at me as I set the water pitcher on the table, her eyes carrying a brief, dismissive sigh. Mom, you should really let Dad handle all the grocery budgets from now on. It's so much easier when we don't have to worry about the cash leaking. Warren slid the orange prepaid card across the pine table. It stopped beside my water glass. Clara, I've topped the card up with another $50 for the Sunday groceries, he said, his tone dry, dismissive. Make sure you keep the receipts. We have to keep the ledger tight for the Q4 audits. I picked up the orange plastic card. He had taken my grandfather's $4,000 writing desk and sold it to fund our daughter's trip. And in return, he was granting me $50 of my own family's wealth, expecting me to manage the bread and milk with gratitude. Psychological insight. To a controlling spouse, your grief is just another commodity to be liquidated. They do not see the empty spaces they leave in your home. They only see the balance sheet of their own survival. But they forget that when you strip a home of its history, you also strip it of its loyalty. On Sunday night at 11 o'clock, after the house had gone completely silent, I sat at my grandfather's old writing desk, not the mahogany one Warren had sold, but a small oak roll-top desk in the basement storage room that Warren had never noticed. I lit a simple white candle, opened my personal laptop, and logged into the corporate registry database for the state's Industrial Licensing Board. I searched for the recent filings under Hensley Precision Tooling, LLC. My eyes scanned the PDF documents until I found the manufacturing agreement executed on Friday morning, the same day Warren had sold my grandfather's desk. The document was a high-volume supply contract with Global Aerospace, LLC. Section 14. Operational Guarantees. The contract required Hensley Precision Tooling to maintain continuous, uninterrupted manufacturing operations at their West River Industrial Park facility, Building 4, throughout the fourth quarter. Any disruption of production or any failure to deliver the titanium bracket shipments by November 15th would trigger a $25,000 daily penalty, personally guaranteed by Warren Hensley's personal assets. Warren had signed a personal guarantee on a $5 million contract, wagering his entire life and everything we owned on a building whose lease was set to expire in exactly 21 days. He had done it because he believed he could force the silent landlord to sell the property to his shell company before the deadline. He had built the cage himself, and now he was walking inside, expecting me to hold the door open. I shut the laptop, blew out the candle, and watched the thin wisp of white smoke disappear into the dark basement air. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock, the sheriff would deliver the lease termination to his desk. The clock was about to run out. On Monday morning at 9:15, the kitchen telephone rang. I was standing in the dining room, a microfiber cloth in my hand, quietly wiping down the mahogany sideboard. The pale, clean ring of dust where my grandfather's blue glass lamp had sat was still visible in the pale morning light, a quiet ghost of my family's history. I picked up the receiver. Clara? Warren's voice was reedy, thin, and stripped of the cold executive weight he had carried at Sunday dinner. I could hear the distant, high-pitched whine of the CNC milling machines in the background, but his breathing was shallow, his words rushed. Clara, I just had a county sheriff's deputy walk into my office. Is everything all right, Warren? I asked, my voice flat, keeping my hand steady on the counter. No, he gasped, his voice cracking. The landlords, Lowell Holdings. They served a formal notice of lease termination on Building 4. We have to evacuate the premises by October 31st. It has to be a mistake, Clara. I've been trying to buy the building. I offered $3 million cash last week. They rejected it, and now this. I don't understand. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, Warren, I said softly. Have you talked to Silas? Silas is on the phone with the broker now, Warren said, his voice rising into a tight, desperate panic. I need you to go into my study. Look in the oak cabinet. There's a black folder labeled Lowell Lease 2014. I need the exact clause on non-renewal. There has to be a grace period. There has to be a buyout option. I walked down the hallway to his study. The room smelled of his expensive cigars and leather polish. I opened the oak cabinet, retrieved the black folder, and opened it on his desk. I already knew every line of the document. I had approved its draft 5 years ago. The clause says the landlord has the unilateral right of non-renewal upon 60 days' notice, Warren, I said, reading the words from the page. There is no buyout option. And the 60-day notice was served in August. This is the final 21-day eviction warning. August? Warren whispered, the sound of his breath catching over the line. But Silas said they were just ignoring our emails. He thought they were negotiating. It seems they weren't, Warren, I said. He hung up without saying goodbye. The line went dead, the soft dial tone filling the quiet study. At 7:30 on Monday evening, Warren sat at the dining room table. He hadn't changed his clothes. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his collar open, his silk tie gone. He sat staring at his empty dinner plate, his face a pale, gray mask of exhaustion. Audrey came into the dining room, her phone clutched in her hand, her face tight with a familiar, demanding pout. "Dad," she said, her voice thin. "The study abroad office just called me again. The wire still didn't clear today. They said if it's not confirmed by tomorrow morning, my spot in Prague is officially gone. What's going on?" Warren's hand shook as he set his fork down against the porcelain plate, the silver making a sharp, vibrating clatter in the quiet room. "I told you, Audrey," Warren snapped, his voice rising into a harsh, angry bark that made her flinch. "The corporate accounts are under review. I am managing a $5 million aerospace contract and a lease termination, and you're crying about a sociology trip? Stop nagging me." Audrey's eyes went wide, her lower lip trembling with a sudden, raw shock. He had never raised his voice to her. He had spent 19 years treating her like a princess, and now, the first crack in his executive armor had exposed the beast beneath. She slowly turned her head, looking at me with a sharp, wet glare of profound, childish resentment. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why aren't you doing anything? Dad is completely stressed and you're just standing there. It's your fault. You must have spent the emergency funds on your stupid organic groceries." Psychological insight. When a father's pride fractures under financial pressure, he turns on the idols of his own making, and the children, terrified of his vulnerability, will always blame the mother to preserve the myth of the father's strength. It is easier for Audrey to believe her mother is a wasteful dependent than to admit her father is drowning. "Audrey," I said, my voice perfectly calm, "go to your room." She looked at me, surprised by the sudden, flat authority in my voice, before turning and fleeing down the hallway, her bedroom door slamming shut behind her. Warren didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on his empty plate, his hands flat on the pine table we had bought with my grandmother's inheritance. On Tuesday morning, I sat in the spare room, the blue glass oil lamp gone, only the empty circle of dust remaining on the sideboard down the hall. I opened my personal laptop and logged into the Lowell Holdings portal. There was an urgent, red-flagged message from Silas Cobb. "Leland Thorne," the message read. "Mr. Hensley is requesting a personal, face-to-face emergency meeting with the Lowell trustee at your offices on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. He is prepared to bring his personal financial statements and the global aerospace contract to guarantee any lease adjustments. Please, we are begging for an audience before the 31st. Leland Thorne's private number flashed on my cell phone a moment later. Clara, Leland said quietly, Warren has requested a meeting tomorrow morning at 10. He's going to be in my main conference room. Do you want me to handle it, or do you want to be there? I looked out the window at the autumn leaves falling across the lawn. I will be there, Leland, I said, my voice as quiet as the room. Have your receptionist seat me in the adjacent office with the double-paned glass. I want to watch him present his ledger. And then? Leland asked. And then, I said, I will walk in. At 9:45 on Wednesday morning, I walked into the offices of Thorne and Associates on Main Street. The lobby was a quiet sanctuary of polished mahogany, leather books, and the muted tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Leland Thorne's receptionist, a quiet woman who had known my family for 20 years, greeted me with a respectful nod and escorted me to the small consultation room adjacent to the main conference room. The double-paned glass window between the two rooms was a mirror from the conference side, but from my side, it was perfectly clear. A small speaker on the wall hummed, piping the audio from the conference room with crisp digital clarity. At 10 o'clock sharp, Warren and Silas Cobb were ushered into the conference room. Warren looked haggard. His bespoke suit was slightly loose on his shoulders, his silver hair uncombed at the temples, his hands clutched tightly around his black leather portfolio. Silas walked behind him, carrying a heavy stack of blue-bound financial folders, looking like a man who had spent the last 72 hours staring at a foreclosure notice. Leland Thorne sat at the head of the conference table, his gold spectacles resting on his nose, his expression a mask of cool, professional detachment. Warren, Silas, Leland said, gesturing to the leather chairs opposite him. Thank you for coming. I understand you have an urgent query regarding Building 4. Warren sat, leaning forward immediately, his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. His voice was tight, high-pitched, stripped of the slow, patronizing confidence he used at my kitchen table. Leland, thank you for seeing us, Warren said, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. This eviction notice. It's a catastrophic mistake. We have a $5 million contract with Global Aerospace. If we are forced to evacuate Building 4 by October 31st, the daily penalties will completely ruin us. It will bankrupt the company. He opened his portfolio, frantically sliding his personal financial statements across the table toward Leland. I am prepared to personally guarantee any lease adjustment, Warren pleaded, his fingers tapping against the paper. We can offer a 6% rent escalation today, or we can proceed with our $3 million cash purchase offer through Patterson Commercial. I have the secondary line of credit fully secured. My family's entire survival relies on this workshop, Leland. My wife? She's completely dependent on my income. She has no head for these matters, and if we go under, she'll be left with nothing. I sat behind the glass, holding my breath, watching my husband brag about my financial incompetence to the very lawyer who managed my grandfather's multi-million-dollar estate. Psychological insight. Arrogance is a blindfold. Even when the truth is standing right in front of him, a controlling husband will always default to his belief in his wife's insignificance to preserve his fragile ego. He cannot see that the woman he treats like a servant is the very foundation of his success. I stood up. I walked to the heavy oak door connecting the two rooms, opened it, and stepped into the main conference room. The brass keyring in my pocket made a soft, metallic clink as I walked. Warren stopped mid-sentence. His eyes went wide with shock, his face instantly turning a deep, angry purple. He stood up so fast his leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Clara?" Warren barked, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and profound embarrassment. "What the hell are you doing here? Did you follow me?" I told you I was in a corporate meeting. This is completely inappropriate. Go wait in the car. He turned to Leland, offering a tight, forced laugh as he adjusted his cuffs. Leland, I am so sorry. My wife, she's been a bit stressed lately over the household budgets. She must have seen the address on my planner. Clara, please, go outside. Leland Thorne didn't stand. He slowly leaned back in his leather chair, took off his gold spectacles, and looked at Warren with a cold, dry smile. Warren, sit down, Leland said, his voice quiet, carrying the absolute weight of the law. Your wife didn't follow you. Clara is the sole trustee of Lowell Holdings. She is the Lowell trustee. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical weight, thick and suffocating, filling the room until the hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. Warren stared at Leland, his mouth opening slightly, his eyes slowly turning to look at me, as if I were a stranger who had just walked through the walls. Silas Cobb looked from Warren to me, his jaw dropping, his folders slipping slightly on the mahogany table. I walked to the table and placed the brass keyring on the polished wood. The metallic ring echoed in the quiet room. I sat in the leather chair beside Leland, my hands folded over my linen skirt. The building is not for sale, Warren, I said, my voice as quiet as the room. And your lease expires on October 31st. Warren stared at the brass keyring resting on the polished mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the dark river. Clara. His voice was a dry, hollow rattle, the executive arrogance completely evaporating from his eyes. No, it's a conflict of interest. Leland, this is some kind of sick joke. She's my wife. Everything she has is marital property. Her grandfather's estate is mine. Leland Thorne didn't flinch. He slowly closed his leather binder and leaned forward, his hands flat on the mahogany. Actually, Warren, the Lowell Commercial Trust was established in 1974 under Clara's maiden name, with a strict marital exclusion clause. It was designed by her grandfather specifically to ensure that no marital partner could ever touch a single brick of the commercial portfolio. It is completely, legally isolated from your marital estate. You have no legal claim to Building 4. Not now, and not on November 1st. Warren turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes wide, with a blank, terrified incomprehension. Clara, please. The global aerospace contract. We have 45 employees. Silas has a family. Why are you doing this? Because of the groceries? Because of the $50 card? It was just a budgeting tool, Clara. I was just trying to protect our cash flow. He still thought it was about the $60 grocery card. He still thought it was a petty domestic dispute, unable to see the 20 years of silent, systematic humiliation he had inflicted on the woman who had washed his shirts and sat in his quiet shadow. It's not about the card, Warren, I said, my voice as calm and quiet as the office. It's about the lease, and your lease is up. Silas Cobb slowly stood up from the conference table. He didn't look at Warren. He looked down at his folders, his face a mask of profound, embarrassed realization. He had spent 10 years watching Warren treat me like a simple, dependent housewife. And now, he had just realized that Warren's entire multi-million-dollar empire had been sitting in my apron pocket the whole time. Warren, Silas said, his voice flat. We need to leave. We have to call the legal team. He picked up his folders and walked out of the conference room without looking back. Warren stood up, his knees visibly shaking, his leather portfolio slipping from his hand and scattering his printed corporate budgets across the floor. He didn't pick them up. He simply turned and stumbled out of the room, his footsteps fading down the quiet hallway. When I returned home at 3 o'clock, the house smelled of old wood and cold air. I walked into the dining room. Warren was sitting on the sofa in the living room, his head in his hands, his bespoke suit wrinkled, his silk tie discarded on the rug near his feet. He looked like an old man who had suddenly lost his way in his own house. Audrey was standing near the dining room sideboard, her face pale, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had received a call from Silas's wife, or perhaps from Warren's secretary. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden raw terror that stripped away every ounce of her youthful dismissiveness. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas's wife just called me. She said we're going to lose the workshop. She said Dad is going to go bankrupt because of the landlord. Mom, is it true? Are you Lowell Holdings? I set my handbag on the dining table. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried, the girl who had spent her teenage years learning to treat her mother like an unproductive burden. "Yes, Audrey," I said softly. "I am." Audrey looked down at the orange prepaid card still sitting on the pine table near Warren's empty plate. Her lower lip began to tremble, her face flushing with a deep, burning shame. She realized, in a single, devastating second, that the mother she had mocked for wasting Dad's hard-earned money was the only reason she had a roof over her head, the only reason she had a college tuition, the only reason she had a flight to Prague. Psychological insight. When a child realizes the mother they dismissed is actually the foundation of their entire security, their arrogance doesn't turn into love. It turns into a quiet, heavy terror. They realize they have spent years mocking the hand that was feeding them, and they are suddenly left standing in the cold house they thought they owned. "Mom," Audrey whispered, her voice wet with tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Go study, Audrey," I said, my voice gentle but entirely empty of the warmth she was desperately seeking. She turned and walked slowly down the hallway, her bedroom door closing without a sound. On Thursday morning, I sat in the spare room. I opened my personal laptop and logged into the Lowell Holdings secure network. There was an urgent, high-priority notification from Leland Thorne's private server. "Clara," the message read, "we've just received a formal inquiry from the General Counsel of Global Aerospace, LLC. They've learned about the lease termination for Building 4. They know Warren cannot fulfill the November 15th delivery without the facility." Leland's private number flashed on my cell phone a moment later. "Clara," Leland said quietly over the line, "Global Aerospace is panicking. They've offered to bypass Warren entirely. They want to know if Lowell Holdings is prepared to purchase Hensley Precision Tooling's machinery and manufacturing assets at a distress foreclosure valuation on November 1st and run the facility under a new corporate entity, with you as the sole owner." I looked at the empty space on the sideboard where my grandfather's blue glass lamp had sat. Warren had sold my grandfather's desk to fund his own corporate reserve, believing he could starve me of my dignity. On November 1st, he was going to find out what it felt like to watch his own wife run his company from his own desk. At midnight on Thursday, the kitchen was silent except for the low, rhythmic hum of the water filtration system behind the drywall. I sat at the kitchen island, holding my grandfather's brass keyring in my palm, the cold metal heavy against my skin. The double doors of the hallway opened, and Warren stepped into the kitchen. He didn't have his jacket on. His bespoke shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled back, his face carrying a look of raw, gray exhaustion that made him look 20 years older. He sat in the chair opposite me, the very chair where he had sat every Sunday evening to audit my $4 grocery receipts. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of every ounce of his executive weight. "We need to talk. Please." I set my mug down, not looking at him. "I'm listening, Warren." "I was wrong," he whispered, his hands flat on the marble counter, his fingers trembling slightly. I didn't know about Lowell Holdings. If I had known, I would have discussed the lease with you. We're a team, Clara. We've been married for 20 years. Everything I built at Hensley Precision Tooling, I built for you and Audrey. I was just trying to protect our family's future." "You built it for your own pride, Warren," I said, my voice as quiet as the kitchen. "You went into my grandfather's room, took photographs of his personal belongings, and sold them to an antique dealer without my permission to cover your own corporate cash flow panic. You put your wife of 20 years on a $60 teenager's allowance card." Warren flinched, his head dropping slightly, his eyes wide with a blank, desperate guilt. "I was under pressure, Clara. The global aerospace contract. I had to show the bank we were lean. I was trying to save us. Please, just sign the lease extension. For Audrey. For our family. If we lose Building 4, I lose everything." He was still trying to use the family as a shield for his own corporate vanity. He wanted me to save his company so he could return to his leather-bound ledger and continue telling me how to spend $50 on groceries. "I will think about it, Warren," I said softly, standing up to put my mug in the sink. At 8 o'clock on Friday morning, the kitchen telephone rang. Warren was sitting at the island, his face pale, his eyes fixed on his laptop screen. He picked up the receiver, his voice trembling as he answered. "Warren Hensley." I stood by the sideboard, quietly dusting the empty space where my grandfather's lamp had sat. I watched his face transition from desperate expectation to a complete, hollow gray. "What do you mean, frozen?" Warren gasped, his hand tightening around the receiver until his knuckles went white. "The secondary line is fully secured. We have the global aerospace contract. You can't call the loan. No, wait. Let me speak to your credit director." The line went dead. Warren slowly lowered the receiver, his hand dropping to the marble counter like a lead weight. First County Bank, having learned of the active lease termination and the impending global aerospace breach of contract, had called his secondary line of credit. They had frozen Hensley Precision Tooling's corporate accounts, locking his operating liquidity and disabling his business credit cards. Warren reached into his pocket, pulled out his personal gold Visa, and stared at it. He tried to log into his banking app, but the screen only displayed a red banner. "Account restricted. Contact customer service." He was completely, utterly broke. His eyes slowly drifted across the marble counter, landing on the small, translucent orange prepaid card he had slid to me on Tuesday morning. The card with the $60 limit. It was currently the only active financial instrument left in the Hensley household. Psychological insight. There is a terrifying irony in watching a husband search for a $6 gallon of milk with the teenager's allowance card he used to humiliate his wife. He had spent 20 years believing his money was his power, and now his survival depended on the $60 he had graciously allocated to me. At 10 o'clock, I met Silas Cobb at the West River Diner. The diner was quiet, smelling of fried lard and old grease. Silas sat in a booth near the back, his laptop open, a stack of payroll folders resting beside his coffee mug. He looked up when I walked in, his face carrying a look of profound, exhausted relief. "Clara," he said, standing up to slide into the opposite side of the booth. "The bank froze the corporate ledger this morning. The employees are panicking about the Friday payroll. If we don't clear the checks by 3 o'clock, 45 families won't be able to pay their mortgages. The payroll has already been cleared, Silas, I said, placing my handbag on the table. I had Leland Thorne's office wire the funds directly from the Lowell Trust this morning. Every employee has been paid in full. Silas let out a slow, shaking breath, his shoulders sagging as if a massive weight had been lifted from his chest. Thank God. You're saving us, Clara. What about Warren? I reached into my bag, pulled out a stack of clean, white documents, and slid them across the table toward him. The documents were the new employment agreements for Lowell Precision Tooling LLC, set to launch on November 1st. On November 1st, Lowell Holdings will purchase the workshop's machinery and physical assets from the bank's foreclosure auction, I said, my voice steady, carrying the absolute weight of the law. Every employee will be transitioned to the new company with a 10% pay increase. Silas, you will remain as general manager, reporting directly to me. Silas looked at the documents, his fingers tracing the green logo of my grandfather's trust. And Warren? Warren's personal assets are guaranteed under the global aerospace contract, I said softly. When the bank forecloses on his assets, he will be left with nothing. But I am prepared to offer him a position under the new corporate structure. Silas looked up, his eyes wide. What position, Clara? General maintenance clerk, I said. He will be responsible for clearing the scrap metal from the production floor, and he will report directly to you. At 3:15 on Friday afternoon, Warren was pacing the kitchen floor. His phone was clutched in his hand, his thumb tapping the screen over and over, as if he could force the bank's restricted banner to disappear by sheer repetition. He was sweating through his bespoke gray shirt, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He was waiting for the phone call from Silas Cobb, the call that would tell him the 45 employees had walked off the floor because their weekly payroll checks had bounced. His phone began to vibrate. He slid the screen to his ear so fast he nearly dropped the device. Silas? Warren gasped, his voice reedy, frantic. Did they walk? I'm working with the bank's litigation officer now. We're trying to secure a temporary release. No, Warren. Silas's voice carried over the speaker, sounding remarkably calm, even relaxed. Nobody walked. Every payroll check cleared at 3 o'clock sharp. The staff is currently on the floor finishing the global bracket run. Warren froze, his eyes staring blankly at the orange prepaid card still sitting on the kitchen island. How? The secondary line is completely locked. Silas, what did you do? Lowell Holdings funded the account directly, Warren, Silas said, his voice dropping into a flat, professional register. They cleared the wire from their private trust. Have a good weekend. The line went dead. Warren slowly lowered the phone, his face turning a dark, heavy purple as he turned to look at me. I was standing by the sink, quietly folding a clean dish towel. You paid the payroll? Warren whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, impotent rage. Why? Why are you playing with my company, Clara? Why are you running these games behind my back? I didn't play with it, Warren, I said, my voice as quiet as the kitchen. I saved it. If those payroll checks had bounced at 3 o'clock, Global Aerospace would have canceled your contract by 4, and your $25,000 daily personal guarantee would have been executed today. You would have been personally bankrupt before sunset. He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, his fingers tightening around his phone until the glass casing creaked. He realized, in a single, devastating second, that I hadn't funded his payroll out of love or marital devotion. I had funded it to protect the asset value of the machinery I was about to buy from his bank on November 1st. Before Warren could speak, the front door clicked open. Audrey walked into the kitchen, her laptop cradled under her arm, her face carrying a look of profound, stunned bewilderment. She stood near the island, her phone clutched in her hand as she stared at her screen. "Dad," she whispered, her voice wet. "The university just emailed me. My Prague study abroad housing is officially confirmed. The department said the wire transfer cleared at noon." She looked at Warren, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate hope. "You did it, didn't you? You saved my trip. Thank you so much, Dad. I knew you'd cover for us." Warren looked at his daughter. He stood in the yellow light of the kitchen, his mouth opening, his throat dry, completely unable to find the words. He knew his bank accounts were frozen. He knew his gold visa was restricted. He knew he didn't have a single dollar to his name. "I wired the deposit, Audrey," I said softly, setting the water pitcher on the dining table. "I had Leland Thorne transfer the funds from the Lowell Trust this morning." Audrey's face went entirely still. She looked from Warren to me, her phone slipping slightly in her hand as her world tilted on its axis. The image of her father, the grand, heroic provider who carried the entire weight of our survival, was gone, replaced by a gray, broken man standing in his wrinkled shirt, unable to even pay for his daughter's flight. Psychological insight. To a child, the father's power is an unquestioned truth, a permanent sun in their domestic sky. Watching that power get quietly, effortlessly replaced by the mother they dismissed is like watching the sun rise in the west. They are left standing in a cold, unfamiliar dawn, realizing that the house they thought was built on their father's strength was actually sitting in their mother's hand the entire time. "Mom," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking, You paid for Prague?" "Yes, Audrey," I said. "Go pack your bags. Your flight is scheduled for Tuesday." She didn't look at Warren. She turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps slow, heavy, and silent. At 10 o'clock that evening, my private cell phone rang. It was Leland Thorne. "Clara," Leland said, his voice deep and dry over the line. "Warren's corporate defense counsel just contacted my office. They're threatening to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on Monday morning. They believe an emergency bankruptcy stay will freeze the lease termination and halt our foreclosure on the machinery." I sat in the spare room, my fingers lightly tracing the brass keyring in my lap. "They're wrong, Leland. Do we still have the original postnuptial agreement Warren forced me to sign in 1999? "We do," Leland said, a paper rustling over the line. "We have the executed copy in our safe." "Under Section 8.4 of that agreement," I said quietly, "is there not a domestic protection clause?" "Yes," Leland murmured, his voice carrying a quiet, satisfied glint. "Warren's lawyers drafted it to ensure that if his business ever faced insolvency, his 50% share of the marital home would automatically transfer to you, isolating the house from his commercial creditors. He wanted to make sure his business partners couldn't touch his residence." "And if he files for corporate bankruptcy on Monday morning," I said, "that technical insolvency is triggered?" "Immediately," Leland said. "The house becomes yours, entirely. He will have no legal right to step across the threshold." "Fax the postnuptial agreement to his attorney's office tonight, Leland," I said. "Tell them if they file for Chapter 11 on Monday morning, Warren will be evicted from this house by Tuesday afternoon." On Saturday morning at 7:30, the kitchen was wrapped in a heavy, freezing silence. I was standing by the stove, pouring hot water into my tea mug when Warren walked into the room. He didn't have his shoes on, his feet bare against the cold hardwood, his gray shirt wrinkled and open at the collar. In his hand, he held a single printed page, the fax his corporate attorney had forwarded to his personal email at midnight. He stood near the island, his shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling in shallow, heavy breaths. He looked at me, his eyes carrying a blank, terrifying quietness that had replaced his executive panic. You had Leland send this, Warren said, his voice dropping into a dry, hollow rattle. My lawyer says if we file for Chapter 11 on Monday morning, to save the workshop, I lose my 50% of this house today. I lose my residence. You designed the contract, Warren, I said, my voice as calm as the kitchen. In 1999, you told me you wanted to ensure the house was always safe from your commercial creditors. You said it was a standard asset protection shield. I didn't think my creditor would be my wife, Clara, he whispered, his fingers tightening around the paper until the corners crumpled. You didn't think your wife was anyone at all, Warren, I said softly, taking a slow sip of my tea. You thought I was just the woman who wiped down the empty spaces in your home. He sat down on the bar stool opposite me, the very stool where he had sat to audit my laundry receipts, and let the paper slip from his hand onto the marble. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. He simply sat in his wrinkled shirt, staring at the translucent orange prepaid card that still lay near his hand, completely empty of power. On Sunday afternoon, I stood in Audrey's bedroom, helping her fold her heavy wool sweaters into her suitcase. The room was quiet, the autumn light streaming through the window, catching the small dust motes dancing in the air. Audrey was silent, her movements slow, her usual anxious chatter completely gone. She folded a cream-colored cardigan, set it in her suitcase, and then paused, her fingers tracing the wool. "Mom," she said, her voice bare, barely louder than the rustle of the packing paper. "I'm sorry. For everything I said. For how I treated you about the groceries." I reached out and took a stack of jeans from her bed, placing them neatly beside her sweaters. "You don't need to apologize, Audrey. You were just living in the house your father built. You didn't know the foundation was made of sand." Audrey looked at me, her eyes wet, her lower lip trembling with a sudden, raw maturity. She looked past me to the dresser, where my grandfather's brass keyring sat in the afternoon sun. "Is Dad going to be okay?" she whispered. "Your father is going to have to learn how to walk on his own feet, Audrey," I said softly. "I've carried him on my grandfather's back for 20 years. Now it's his turn to learn the cost of the road." Audrey looked at her hands, then back at me, a sudden, quiet understanding dawning in her eyes. Psychological insight. When a daughter finally sees her mother's strength, she doesn't just see a protector, she sees her own potential. The myth of the patriarchal shield dissolves, leaving room for a real, quiet sisterhood of survival. Audrey had spent her life believing her father was the sun, but she had just realized her mother was the gravity keeping their entire world from flying into the dark. "I love you, Mom," she said. "I love you too, Audrey," I said. "Now, close the bag. Your flight leaves on Tuesday." On Sunday night at 10 o'clock, the house was completely still. I walked into Warren's study to ensure the windows were locked against the autumn dampness. The room smelled of cold cigar smoke and leather. As I reached for the latch on the window, my eyes landed on Warren's personal leather-bound planner sitting open on his empty desk. My eyes scanned his handwriting on Monday's page. Monday, 2 p.m., meeting with private liquidator, gold/annuity cash out. I leaned over the desk, my fingers lightly tracing the ink. Warren was planning to secretly liquidate his personal retirement annuity and his private collection of gold coins, stored in the bank's safety deposit box, to hide the cash before the global aerospace default was executed on Monday afternoon. He was trying to strip his last personal reserves to run. But he had forgotten that Leland Thorne had already filed a lease pendants and a temporary asset restraining order with the county court at 4:30 on Friday afternoon, following the formal global aerospace default notice. The bank vault was already locked to him. The liquidator would meet him at 2 o'clock, but Warren would walk away empty-handed. His gold and his annuity frozen under my grandfather's corporate seal. I reached down and closed his planner, his leather-bound schedule of failures, and walked out of the room. I held the brass keyring in my pocket. The keys to Building 4 were there, but so were the keys to the main house. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the sheriff would deliver the final papers to his desk. The countdown was officially over. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I parked my sedan in the gravel lot of the West River Industrial Park, 30 yards from the red brick facade of Building 4. The morning was cold, a light, biting mist rising from the river. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching through the windshield. Right on schedule, a white county sheriff's SUV pulled into the lot, parking directly behind Warren's luxury corporate sedan. Two deputies in brown uniforms stepped out, carrying a leather folder of legal documents. They walked through the front doors of Hensley Precision Tooling without knocking. 10 minutes later, Silas Cobb walked out to the loading dock, his hands in his pockets, his face flat and sober as he watched his 45 employees slowly filter out of the building. They stood in the damp gravel, their safety glasses pushed up on their foreheads, watching in a quiet, heavy silence as Warren was escorted out of the administrative lobby. He wasn't in handcuffs. It was a civil foreclosure of the machinery, not a criminal arrest. But the humiliation was absolute. He was carrying a single shallow cardboard box containing his personal desk items, his gold-plated pen, his leather planner, and his framed corporate certificates. As he walked to his car, his eyes caught the reflection of my sedan. He stopped, his boots freezing in the gravel, his face a pale, gray mask of shock as he stared through the glass at me. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't wave. I simply sat in the quiet of my car, my hand resting on my grandfather's brass keyring, and watched my husband realize that his entire 20-year empire had just been packed into a cardboard box. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I returned to our kitchen. Warren was already there. He was sitting on the floor of his study down the hall, his personal safe open and completely empty, not because he had successfully liquidated his assets, but because the bank manager had refused to let him open his safety deposit box at 2 o'clock. He walked into the kitchen, his voice a dry, ragged whisper, his bespoke shirt stained with gray dust from his safe. "Clara," he said, his hand trembling as he leaned against the marble island. "The bank, they wouldn't let me open the box. The manager told me my personal assets are under a temporary restraining order from the court. Even my grandfather's gold coins, they're locked. I couldn't even buy gas on the way home. My gold card was declined at the pump." He looked down at the island, his eyes locking onto the small, translucent orange prepaid card that still lay near his empty plate. "I don't have enough money to buy lunch, Clara," he whispered, his eyes wide, filled with a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. "I have nothing. The bank called the loan on my car this afternoon." I reached out, picked up the orange card, and tapped the screen of my phone, authorizing a temporary increase of $20. I slid the card back to him across the cold marble. "You can use this for your gas, Warren," I said, my voice as calm as the kitchen. "Make sure you keep the receipt. I'll need to audit the ledger tonight." He stared at the orange plastic card, his face flushing with a deep, burning humiliation that made his chest rise and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. Psychological insight. To a husband who used financial starvation as a tool of marital discipline, the ultimate terror is not being poor. It is being treated with the exact same cold, polite indifference he used to break his wife. He was now the dependent, waiting for a $20 authorization on a teenager's card, realizing too late that his pride had been his only currency. On Tuesday morning at 6 o'clock, I drove Audrey to the airport. The terminal was quiet, smelling of coffee and jet fuel. Audrey hugged me tightly near the security gate, her face wet with a sudden soft tears. "Thank you, Mom. For Prague, for being strong. I'll call you when I land." "Have a wonderful trip, Audrey," I said, kissing her cheek. "Focus on your studies." At 10 o'clock, I drove to the main conference room of Thorne and Associates. Leland Thorne sat at the head of the table, alongside 3 executives from Global Aerospace LLC, dressed in identical charcoal suits. On the table lay the newly drafted manufacturing agreement for Lowell Precision Tooling LLC. The lead acquisition executive, Mr. Davis, a man with a sharp professional eye, leaned forward. "Mrs. Hensley, we are prepared to execute the new agreement today. The daily liquidated penalties are waived under the Lowell transition, and the bank has approved the foreclosure sale of the machinery to your trust. But we have one technical concern." I looked at him. "And what is that, Mr. Davis?" "Warren Hensley is still the primary designer of the titanium bracket molds," Mr. Davis said. "We need his technical expertise to clear the November 15th delivery. Without his hand on the calibration, we face a quality compliance risk. Is he going to be on the floor?" "Yes, Mr. Davis," I said, reaching into my bag and sliding a copy of Warren's new employment agreement across the table. "I've already drafted his contract." Mr. Davis picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the lines before his eyebrows shot up in a sudden quiet shock. He looked at Leland Thorne, then back to me, a slow, knowing smile touching his lips. "A general maintenance clerk, Mrs. Hensley?" Mr. Davis asked. "At $15 an hour?" "Warren is exceptional with cleanup, Mr. Davis," I said softly, picking up my grandfather's brass keyring. "He's had 20 years of practice managing the domestic overhead." On November 1st, the autumn leaves were falling thick and wet across the asphalt of the West River Industrial Park. I stood in the clean, heated vestibule of Building 4, my grandfather's brass keyring clutched tightly in my hand. The heavy red brick facade looked solid, timeless, the brass letters above the double-glass doors newly polished. They no longer read Hensley Precision Tooling. They read Lowell Precision Tooling, LLC. Silas Cobb walked out of the administrative office, holding his clipboard, a neat stack of production orders for Global Aerospace resting beneath his thumb. He looked at me, his eyes carrying a quiet, respectful warmth that had replaced the frantic stress of the last 3 weeks. "The lathe teams are already on their second shift, Clara," Silas said, pointing to the glowing digital monitors on the manufacturing floor. "The first batch of titanium brackets cleared the quality compliance check at 8 o'clock. We're on track to meet the November 15th delivery with 48 hours to spare." "Thank you, Silas," I said softly, looking through the glass window at the heavy milling machines humming on the concrete. "Keep the floor clean." I walked down the metal catwalk overlooking the production bay. Near the back of the facility, near the raw steel storage racks, a man in a simple gray utility jumpsuit was quietly sweeping the metal shavings from the floor, shoveling them into a heavy blue bin. It was Warren. He didn't have his bespoke suit on, and his gold watch was gone. He looked smaller, his shoulders slightly rounded as he pushed the heavy broom across the concrete. He stopped, looking up to see me standing on the catwalk. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply adjusted his safety glasses, looked down at his broom, and continued to sweep, his movements slow, practiced, and entirely silent. He was earning $15 an hour, reporting directly to Silas Cobb, and his weekly pay would be deposited onto the same orange prepaid card he had used to monitor my life. At 4 o'clock, I drove back to our house. The dining room was quiet. the pale autumn light streaming through the arched windows, catching the small dust motes dancing in the air. I set my handbag on the pine table and walked over to the mahogany sideboard. The pale, clean ring of dust was gone. Sitting in the exact center of the polished wood was my grandfather's blue glass oil lamp, its wick clean, a small, warm, yellow flame flickering behind the glass. Behind it, in the spare room down the hall, my grandfather's mahogany writing desk sat in its original corner, its dark wood catching the soft afternoon light. Warren walked into the house 30 minutes later, his gray utility jumpsuit smelling of machine oil and cold rain. He stopped in the dining room doorway, his eyes immediately locking on to the blue glass lamp. "You bought them back," Warren whispered, his voice dry, reedy, and entirely stripped of his old corporate pride. "Finch, you paid him the $4,000. "No, Warren," I said, my voice as calm as the quiet house. "Mr. Finch didn't buy them. He is Leland Thorne's brother-in-law. I staged the sale of the desk and the lamp to see if you would actually sell my grandfather's memory to cover your own debt." Warren stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth opening slightly as the first cold wave of realization washed over his face. I walked to the mahogany writing desk, opened the top drawer, and pulled out a yellowed, single-sheet document. The original loan agreement from September 14th, 1998. Signed by Warren and my grandfather, Arthur Lowell. "Your father didn't leave you $50,000 to start Hensley Precision Tooling, Warren," I said, my voice carrying the absolute weight of the truth. "My grandfather lent it to you. The collateral for that loan was 100% of your company's intellectual property and patents." Warren stumbled back, his hand reaching out to clutch the doorframe for support. No, I paid that loan back in 2002. I cleared the ledger." "You paid the interest, Warren," I said softly, turning the yellowed page to show him his own signature. "But you defaulted on the principal balloon payment in 2002. My grandfather quietly bought the default from the bank, holding the assignment in his private trust. He told Leland that if you ever tried to starve me, the trust would collect the debt and take the patents." I set the yellowed paper on the sideboard, beside the warm flame of the blue glass lamp. "You spent 20 years believing you built an empire on your own sweat, Warren," I said, my voice as quiet as the room. "But you were just running a workshop on my grandfather's loan, in my grandfather's building, while your wife bought your groceries." Warren looked from the paper to the lamp, his shoulders slumping, his head dropping into his chest. He was completely, utterly defeated. The grand, heroic myth of his self-made success had vanished, leaving him with nothing but a gray jumpsuit and a $15 an hour broom. He turned and walked slowly up the stairs to the guest bedroom, his bare feet soft against the hardwood. I stood in the quiet dining room, watching the yellow flame flicker behind the blue glass. I picked up my grandfather's brass keyring, the heavy keys cold and solid in my hand. Warren had spent 20 years monitoring my pennies, completely unaware that he was living on my grace.